Can you think of an example of a really iconically terrifying villain from genre fiction who was made significantly less terrifying in subsequent sequels or universe-expanding stories? Of course you can. That's just what happens to scary villains. But why? Let's get into it. Welcome to Think Thing, a channel featuring video essays about media, politics, science, or whatever else I think is interesting. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, please consider subscribing, giving the video a like, or expressing your approval in some other way. Thanks so much. So I've been thinking a lot about villains lately. In particular, I've been thinking about the problem of what I have come to call the Nameless Dread. This is a particular sort of villain who is a seemingly unstoppable force of evil. They are irredeemable, utterly, definitionally corrupt and vile.
That's what he does! That's all he does!
Horror, as a genre, is full of these sorts of characters. Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, the titular It from It Follows. There's no shortage of examples from horror because that's the primary role of a Nameless Dread, to scare the bejesus out of you. These characters are fundamentally uncomplicated by design. It doesn't matter why they do what they do. Their motivation is unimportant. All that matters is the fear that they represent. The Nameless Dread is a useful tool in a writer's narrative tool belt, an essential one in horror, I would argue. But it's also quite useful in fantasy and science fiction. It's a simple and effective way to raise the stakes your protagonist faces and to get the audience emotionally connected to the action. But there's a problem with Nameless Dread characters that may be particular to streaming episodic storytelling, and it's this. They have a half-life. The ability of a Nameless Dread to effectively scare your audience diminishes with each passing second of screen time that they get.
I know now why you cry, but it's something I can never do.
On screen.
Star Trek The Next Generation introduced a Nameless Dread in Season 2 with the first appearance of the Borg.
This is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the U.S.
We have analyzed your defensive capabilities as being unable to withstand us. If you defend yourselves, you will be punished.
These were unstoppable cybernetic killing machines with overwhelming technological superiority. The only thing protecting the Federation from being utterly wiped out by the Borg was the vast distance between Earth and the Borg's sphere of influence, a distance the Borg managed to traverse by the end of Season 3, when Captain Picard was captured and assimilated by the Borg Collective in one of the greatest cliffhanger season finales in science fiction television history.
I am Locutus of Borg. Resistance is futile.
But television shows keep on going, and the more the writers drank from the Borg well, the drier it got. The ways in which the Trek franchise has defanged the Borg over the intervening years are too numerous to detail here.
Must Geordi be assimilated?
But I'll just mention that in Picard Season 2, the Borg Queen creates a diversion at a NASA event in the 21st century by performing a torch song version of Pat Benatar's Shadows of the Night. Yes, that really happened.
It worked.
It's canon now. Not every Nameless Dread is doomed to eventually break into song if they get too much screen time.
Bugger this.
But it's the nature of multi-season arcs and writers' rooms to mine story beats that have worked in the past for new material, and that can lead to a diminishment of the ability of a Nameless Dread to strike the same scary note after a while.
Are you ever lonely?
Nameless Dread characters aren't particularly complex, and so by definition, they're kind of uninteresting. Michael Myers was literally just called The Shape in the first Halloween movie. Other characters in the film spend a bit of time speculating about why he is the way he is, but no explanation is satisfying, and so a good writer will know to never give you one. The minute we get an explanation of why Michael Myers is the way he is the minute the character stops being scary. When done right, storytellers use their Nameless Dread characters with restraint. Look at how Spielberg only gave us glimpses of the shark in Jaws. The titular Lord in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is a Nameless Dread, and despite the heavy page count, Sauron is barely in that book. He's spoken about quite a lot by other characters, but Tolkien knew to keep his most evil and terrifying character off the page. I would argue that Nameless Dread characters aren't really characters at all in the traditional sense. They're shortcuts. If you develop a Nameless Dread into a real character with a backstory, motivations, goals, and an inner life, you've changed them into something fundamentally different. Which isn't to say you should never do that. Again, in the era of streaming episodic storytelling, Nameless Dreads are hard to maintain over time. Eventually, you'll have to give your audience something else.
So you haven't murdered anybody lately? Let's be best pals.
That's what I think is so interesting and so divisive about Sauron on Amazon Prime's Rings of Power. So, spoiler alert for Rings of Power if you haven't seen it yet. But in season 1 of the show, Sauron is revealed to be a fellow named Halbrand, who rescues Galadriel from drowning and then allies with her in Numenor and eventually accompanies her to the Southlands of Middle-earth to help free some enslaved humans from a band of orcs. There are a couple of scenes in the Southlands between Galadriel and Halbrand where Halbrand's emotional state is clearly not just a put-on.
Fighting at your side, I felt... If I could just hold on to that feeling. Keep it with me always. Bind it to my very being. Then I felt it too.
Halbrand obviously feels a real connection to the elf. He seems genuinely conflicted about whether to accept the role of King of the Southlands. His decision, helped by Galadriel, to spare Adar really does seem like a point of emotional progress. So one asks, how could this really be Sauron? If there's one thing we know about the Dark Lord, it's that he is malevolence personified. He is unambiguously evil, seeking to cover all of Middle-earth in darkness and ruin. Halbrand, by contrast, is obviously conflicted emotionally and seems to have at least a sense of honor, if not actual altruism. And sure, some of that may just be part of a grand manipulation for Galadriel's benefit, but the choices the actor is making leave little room for, psych, it was all a long con, I was evil all along. Adar's character is fascinating in this context. He is an elf who was corrupted by Morgoth in the process of creating the orcs. As such, he feels an attachment to and a responsibility for the orcs. He wants them to have a home where they can be free to live and be outside during the day and not be constantly hunted by elves and men. He is, to put it bluntly, the sort of villain that Tolkien never really gave us. A three-dimensional one. Adar is a bad guy, there is no doubt. His plan will cause much suffering to many in Middle-earth, and he has tortured and killed men and elves in pursuit of his plan. But the reason he is committing these acts of brutality is in service of what he sees as something noble, a homeland for his people.
We are creations of the One, master of the secret fire, the same as you, as worthy of the breath of life, and just as worthy of a home.
Adar being such a clear three-dimensional villain in Rings of Power suggests to me that perhaps the creators are actually attempting to give Sauron himself some of that same tragic complexity. Perhaps Halbrand/Sauron really is conflicted. Perhaps he feels a connection, or a kinship, or even an attraction to Galadriel. He finds himself in Episode 6 in a position to make a choice about how to live in Middle-earth and what sort of a being he wants to be. And there are hints that he's tempted to make a better choice than the one we know he will ultimately make. After all, Rings of Power is a prequel, and any character development done now must ultimately lead to the Nameless Dread we all know from Lord of the Rings. The clues for this sort of treatment are all there. Note how, during Galadriel's interrogation of Adar, her blind hatred of orcs and refusal to recognize them as beings with agency deserving of any respect, or even of their lives, means that she cedes the moral high ground to Adar in that scene.
One day, before I drive my dagger into your poisoned heart, I will whisper in your piked ear that all your offspring are dead, and the scourge of your kind ends with you.
It would seem I'm not the only elf alive that's being transformed by darkness.
I certainly didn't see that coming, and it hints at the creators subtly addressing a problem Tolkien has always had when it comes to race politics. The idea that some of the races in Middle-earth are just always evil, that it's in their nature. A race of innately evil monsters being ruled by a malevolent dark wizard might make for good, scary fairy tale villains, but any analog to the real world becomes immediately problematic. If I'm right, and the showrunners are seeking to narratively address the problem of the innate evilness of orcs, then that is the truly radical political idea that the show is embracing. Not that some of the characters have brown skin, which even Tolkien himself imagined. When Rings of Power began, many people wondered if the show would succeed at living up to Tolkien's vision and genius, and at least in this one respect, I'm beginning to wonder if it will actually exceed it. The danger, of course, is that if the show turns Sauron into a complicated three-dimensional character, it will make him less scary. I, for one, will take complicated and three-dimensional over simple but terrifying any day of the week. Just please, for the love of Eru Iluvatar, don't make him sing. Thanks so much for watching. I'm curious to know what your favorite examples of Nameless Dread characters are, particularly ones that have been fleshed out in sequels or adaptations. Were those characters ruined for you once you got to know them a bit? Let me know in the comments.